Welcome. America is a land of forgotten legends. We have relegated our monsters to campfire tales and grainy photographs, dismissing them as folklore, as hoaxes, as childish fantasies. The Thunderbird, the Jersey Devil, the Wendigo, and of course, the most famous of all, Bigfoot, Sasquatch. Most people laugh at the stories, at the blurry figures caught on film, at the oversized footprints found in the mud. But some forests, the old and deep ones, they do not forget. And they do not like to be mocked. They hold their secrets close, and they guard them with a primal, patient ferocity. Tonight's story is about 4 men who walked into one such forest, into the deep, untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. They were armed with modern technology, with high-powered rifles, and with a dangerous, foolish arrogance. They believed they were the hunters, and that the legend was their prey. They were wrong. This is the story of a hunt that went terribly wrong. It is the story of what happens when the legend decides to hunt back. The journey into the deep, untamed wilderness of Washington state began with a feeling of boisterous, almost childish excitement. The narrator, an omniscient observer, could see the stark contrast between the 4 men packed into the rattling SUV. Marcus, with the manic gleam of a true believer in his eyes, was the expedition's charismatic leader, his lap a chaotic mess of topographical maps and annotated satellite images. He tapped a finger on the map, his voice booming with confidence. "This is it, boys. The nesting ground. No one's ever been this deep before." Ben, the group's tech-savvy documentarian, wasn't looking at the map. His focus was on the array of cameras and sensitive audio equipment he had meticulously packed in the back. He envisioned the glory, the viral fame that would come from capturing the first clear footage of the creature. He dreamed of documentary deals and late-night talk show appearances, the undisputed proof of the impossible held in his hands. In the back, Davis sat with a quiet, dangerous energy, his large hunting rifle resting across his lap. He cleaned the barrel for the 3rd time, the metallic scrape a sharp, punctuating sound in the cramped vehicle. He wasn't here for fame or for science. He was here for the hunt, for the thrill of staring down a legend and being the one to pull the trigger. And then there was Cole, the only one among them with true, practical wilderness experience. He sat in the passenger seat, a silent and uneasy passenger in their vehicle of ambition. This simmering tension between the other 3's excitement and Cole's quiet apprehension was a palpable thing. He looked out the window at the towering, indifferent pines and felt a profound sense of unease. He couldn't put a name to it, but he felt as though the forest was welcoming them a little too eagerly, that the path into its depths was a little too clear, as if a predator had deliberately left a trail for its prey to follow. The others saw a grand adventure unfolding. Cole, however, felt like he was walking into a trap. They hiked for nearly 2 hours, the initial burst of adrenaline and excitement slowly giving way to the steady, grueling rhythm of the trail. The path, which had started as a clearly marked track, had devolved into a faint, almost invisible trail, forcing them to rely on Marcus' maps and Cole's innate sense of direction. The forest here was older, darker, the trees growing so close together that their branches formed a dense, interlocking canopy, plunging the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. It was Marcus who found it. He had been a few yards ahead of the others, his eyes scanning the ground with the intensity of a zealot searching for a sign. He stopped so abruptly that Ben, who was filming him, nearly walked right into his back. "This is it," Marcus breathed, his voice a low, reverent whisper. He pointed down at the damp, mossy earth. The others crowded around. There, pressed deep into the soil, was a footprint. It was massive, easily twice the size of a man's foot, and unmistakably primate in shape, with a wide, flat sole and 5 clearly defined toes. It was a perfect, undeniable print. A wave of triumphant energy surged through the group. Ben fumbled with his camera, zooming in on the print, his hands shaking with excitement. "Oh my God," he whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." Davis let out a low, predatory chuckle. his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Well, what do you know?" he said, a hungry glint in his eyes. "The big guy's out for a walk." But Cole did not share their excitement. While the others celebrated, he knelt down, his expression grim and analytical. He saw what they, in their elation, had missed. The print was impossibly deep, suggesting a creature of immense weight. And the stride, he looked ahead, finding the next partial print nearly 10 feet away. Whatever had made this track was not just large, it was powerful. He stood up and scanned the surrounding forest, his unease from the car ride returning with a vengeance. He noticed something else, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The track didn't cross their path in a straight line, as an animal simply moving through its territory would. Instead, the faint impressions in the dirt suggested a path that ran parallel to their own for at least 100 yards before this single, perfect print was left in the open. It hadn't just been walking through the woods, it had been following them, watching them, and this single, perfect print, left in the middle of their path where they couldn't possibly miss it, felt less like a random piece of evidence and more like a deliberate act. It was a message, a calling card. It felt like the creature was not just aware of them, but was now inviting them deeper into its domain, into a game where they did not know the rules. The discovery of the footprint electrified the group. For Marcus, Ben, and Davis, it was the ultimate validation. The moment their wild, speculative hunt transformed into a real, tangible expedition. They spent nearly half an hour documenting it, with Ben filming the print from every conceivable angle, while Marcus took plaster casts, his hands moving with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a priceless artifact. Only Cole remained apart, his sense of unease solidifying into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He saw the print not as a discovery, but as a deliberate signpost, a breadcrumb left to lure them deeper into the woods. Energized by their find, they pushed on with a renewed, almost reckless vigor. The faint trail they were following began to descend into a darker, more primal part of the forest. Here, the air was thick and heavy, the sunlight almost completely choked out by the dense canopy of Asian fir and cedar trees. The ground was a soft, damp carpet of moss and decaying pine needles that swallowed the sound of their footsteps, adding to the growing sense of oppressive quiet. It was about a mile further in that they found the first omen, a quiet, rusting testament to the raw power that inhabited these woods. Half buried in the moss and dirt was an old bear trap, a relic from a bygone era of trapping. It was a massive, cruel-looking thing, its toothed jaws wide enough to snap a man's leg in two. But it wasn't the trap itself that made them stop. It was what had been done to it. The trap had been sprung, but not in the normal way. Instead of being closed, its two thick steel jaws had been bent outwards, twisted back at an impossible angle as if by a colossal, inhuman force. The metal was warped and buckled, the powerful spring mechanism shattered. "Holy," Ben breathed, lowering his camera. "What in the world could do that?" Davis let out a low whistle, a sound of grudging respect. He nudged the mangled steel with the toe of his boot. "That's a big, angry grizzly, right? There," he said with a confident smirk, though the narrator could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Must have gotten his paw caught and just ripped the whole damn thing apart. But Cole knew better. He had spent his life in the wilderness. He had seen what a grizzly could do. A bear, no matter how large or enraged, could not bend half-inch thick spring steel backwards. This was something else entirely. He knelt, examining the warped metal, and saw deep, gouge-like marks that were not from any bear claw he had ever seen. He looked at Marcus, hoping his friend, the supposed expert, would see the same terrifying implication. But Marcus was too caught up in his own narrative. "This is its territory," he said, his voice filled with a kind of manic awe. "It's showing us its strength. It's a warning." For once, Cole agreed with him. It was a warning. It was a clear, brutal, and unambiguous message. But while Marcus saw it as a thrilling challenge from a worthy adversary, Cole saw it for what it truly was, a predator, displaying the mangled remains of a lesser hunter's trap as a quiet, chilling promise of what it could do to them. After leaving the mangled bear trap behind, a subtle but deeply unnerving change fell over the forest. It was not a sound, but the lack of one. The narrator, watching the four men, could see the moment the change washed over them. Ben was the first to notice. He had his shotgun microphone pointed into the canopy, hoping to capture the ambient sounds of the old-growth forest, but all he was getting was the faint hiss of his own equipment. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the microphone. "It's like everything just shut off." He was right. The cheerful chirping of birds, which had been a constant, chattering backdrop to their hike, had ceased. The buzz of insects, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, all of it had vanished. The forest had fallen deathly silent. It was not the peaceful quiet of a lazy afternoon. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that feels like the entire ecosystem is holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. Marcus, obsessed with the tracks, barely registered the change. To him, the silence meant fewer distractions. Davis was the same. He saw the quiet as a tactical advantage, making it easier to hear the footsteps of his quarry. But Cole felt it. To him, this silence was the most terrifying omen yet. He had spent his life in woods like these, and he knew that a silent forest is a frightened forest. It meant that a top predator, something that all other living creatures knew to flee from, was nearby. He stopped, taking a deep breath, trying to scent the air. There was no smell of bear or cougar, just the damp, loamy scent of moss and decay. He looked ahead at Marcus, who was pushing forward eagerly. "Marcus," Cole called out, his voice low and urgent. "We should turn back. Something's not right." Marcus turned, a look of annoyance on his face. "Not right?" "Cole, we just found definitive proof. We're closer than ever. This is no time to get spooked." "This is exactly the time to get spooked," Cole retorted, his voice filled with a desperate earnestness. "This forest is terrified. Can't you feel it?" But Marcus had already turned away, dismissing Cole's warning as an inconvenience. To him, Cole's fear was just weakness. The narrator knew that in that moment, Marcus's arrogance had sealed their fate. They continued deeper into the predator's territory, into a silence that grew heavier and more menacing with every step. Unaware that they were no longer just being watched, they were being led. Cole's warning, born from a lifetime of reading the subtle, unspoken language of the wilderness, was lost on the others. To them, the silence was not a symptom of fear. It was a blank canvas onto which they could project their own ambitions. Their guide was not the living, breathing forest around them, but a dead, brittle piece of paper that Marcus now unfolded with the reverence of a scholar handling an ancient scroll. This map was their guide, a relic Marcus had bought from an online auction, supposedly belonging to a legendary local trapper who had vanished in these same woods in the 1950 seconds. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn thing, the paper yellowed and creased with age, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. It depicted the region with an intimate, hand-drawn detail that no modern topographical survey could replicate. It showed hidden streams, long-forgotten game trails, and handwritten notes in a spidery, elegant script. "Look at this," Marcus said, his voice a low, excited whisper as he traced a line with his finger. He marked a series of caves just over this next ridge. Deep dens, he calls them. That's where it has to be sleeping during the day. Ben leaned in, his camera recording over Marcus's shoulder, capturing the image of the old map that promised so much. Davis stood back, his arms crossed, his expression one of bored impatience. His job wasn't to read maps, it was to shoot what they found. But Cole, looking over Marcus's other shoulder, saw something else. It was another piece of handwriting, a small, almost desperate scribble in the margin of the map, far away from the main notes. It was a different color ink, as if added later, in a moment of panicked haste. This was the rambling, cautionary story of the guide, the one they were about to ignore. Cole leaned closer, his own flashlight beam illuminating the spidery, desperate script in the map's margin. The handwriting was starkly different from the trapper's main notes, as if written by a different person or by the same person in a state of profound terror. The narrator, an unseen observer, could feel the cold dread emanating from the faded ink. The words were a clear and desperate plea. "It's smart," the note read. "It sets traps, not with steel, but with sound. It knows you're coming. Stay away from the Valley of Bones at all costs." Cole felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. The Valley of Bones. The name was something straight out of a grim fairy tale, and the warning was chillingly specific. It sets traps. It knows you're coming. He looked up from the map, his eyes wide with a new and specific fear. "Marcus," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Did you see this?" Marcus, however, was not afraid. He was electrified. He saw the warning not as a deterrent, but as a confirmation. A giant, flashing arrow pointing him toward his goal. "The Valley of Bones," he breathed, a manic grin spreading across his face. "Of course, that's where it has to be. The trapper must have seen it there." "He's telling us to stay away, Marcus," Cole insisted, tapping his finger on the desperate scroll. "This isn't a suggestion. It's a warning from a man who probably died out here." But Marcus's obsession had completely eclipsed his caution. He saw himself on the verge of the greatest discovery of the century, and he would not be deterred by the fearful scribblings of a long-dead trapper. He saw Cole's fear not as a valid response to a clear danger, but as a weakness, an obstacle to his ambition. "That's where we're going," Marcus declared, his voice full of a finality that left no room for argument. He was probably just trying to scare off other hunters, to keep the prize for himself. The narrator could see the conflict in the group. Ben, ever the loyal follower, nodded in agreement with Marcus, his camera already pointed in the direction the map indicated. Davis just shrugged, his hand resting on his rifle. He didn't care about the warnings, he only cared about the hunt. Only Cole felt the true weight of the trapper's last words. He looked from Marcus's manic, determined face to the dark, silent forest that surrounded them. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching his friends cheerfully prepare to jump, completely oblivious to the long, fatal drop below. He had a choice: abandon them to their foolish quest, or follow them into a place that a dead man had begged him to avoid. His loyalty in that moment became his curse. He said nothing more, but as he shouldered his pack and followed the others, a sense of grim resignation settled over him. They were walking into a trap, and the map they held in their hands was the bait. They had been hiking for another hour in the oppressive, listening silence, following Marcus's determined lead towards the area the old map had labeled the Valley of Bones. The forest here was different, older. The trees were gnarled giants, their trunks thick as small cars and draped in long, green beards of moss. The air was heavy and cold, and the light that filtered through the dense canopy was a dim, green-gray, like the light at the bottom of a deep lake. It was Ben who saw the first one. "Whoa, guys, check this out," he said, his voice a hushed whisper as he pointed his camera into a small, shadowed alcove just off the trail. The others gathered around, and the collective, uneasy silence fell over them. Leaning against the trunk of a massive cedar tree was a strange structure. It was a tall, teepee-like cone, nearly 10 feet high, woven together from dozens of long, straight branches that had been stripped of their leaves and bark. The construction was intricate, almost artistic, the branches interwoven with a precision that spoke of deliberate, intelligent hands. It was not a random pile of deadfall. It was not a shelter any known animal would build. It looked almost ritualistic. "What is that?" Ben whispered, slowly circling the structure with his camera. "Some kind of old tribal marker?" "Or a nest," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with a feverish excitement. He saw this not as a warning, but as another piece of the puzzle, a big one. But Cole knew it wasn't a nest. No creature built a nest like this, so exposed, so symbolic. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The structure reminded him of the strange, abstract sculptures he's seen in modern art museums, but this was no museum. This felt ancient, a piece of art made by a mind that did not think like a human. He noticed that the ground around the base of the structure was completely clear of leaves and debris in a perfect 10-foot circle, as if it had been swept clean. As they pushed forward, they began to see more of them. They were everywhere. Some were tall cones like the first one. Others were complex, lattice-like walls of interwoven sticks, stretched between two trees. They even found a large, perfectly formed archway made of bent saplings, framing the path ahead like a gateway into another world. The growing unease had now become a tangible, palpable presence. Ben, the documentarian, saw it all as fascinating B-roll footage for his film. Davis, the hunter, saw them as nothing more than weird piles of sticks, an irrelevant distraction from the real prize. Marcus, the obsessive, saw them as the territorial markings of a complex, intelligent creature. But Cole, the survivor, saw them for what they truly were. They were not nests or art or trail markers. They were decorations, and he had the terrible, sinking feeling that they were walking down the main hall of a cathedral belonging to a god they were not prepared to meet. They made camp as the last of the weak, green-gray light faded from the sky. The oppressive silence of the forest seemed to intensify with the darkness, creating a suffocating, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. No one spoke much. The bravado and excitement from the start of their journey had completely evaporated, replaced by a quiet, gnawing tension. Ben kept his camera off, no longer interested in documenting the eerie quiet. David sat cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the impenetrable wall of darkness that surrounded their small campfire. Marcus stared into the flames, his face a mask of intense concentration, but the narrator could see the flicker of a new, unwelcome emotion in his eyes: fear. Only Cole seemed to be in his element, though his calmness was born of a grim acceptance rather than peace. He moved methodically, securing their food supplies high in a tree and building up the fire, his actions practical and focused. He knew that the strange stick structures and the profound silence were just the prelude. The real test would come with the night. It came just after midnight. It was a sound that started so low it was felt more than heard. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. It was not the sound of any known animal. It grew slowly, steadily, a long, mournful note that rose in pitch until it became a full-throated howl. Marcus and Ben scrambled for their recording equipment, their scientific and journalistic instincts momentarily overriding their fear. Davis gripped his rifle, his knuckles white, his eyes wide as he stared into the darkness from which the sound had come. But Cole, who was closest to the fire, had a different reaction. The sound washed over him, and he felt not just terror, but a profound and inexplicable sadness. It was not the challenging roar of a predator claiming its territory. It was not the aggressive howl of a wolf pack. It was a sound of immense, soul-deep pain. It sounded like a lament, a cry of grief so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the forest. It was the sound of a being in mourning. The howl continued for a full, heart-stopping minute before it slowly faded away, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying than the sound itself. The four men sat frozen, the echo of that impossible, mournful cry still ringing in their ears. "What in God's name was that?" Ben finally whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Marcus, despite the clear fear in his own eyes, forced a confident smile. "That," he said, his voice a triumphant whisper, "was our guy. He knows we're here, and he's letting us know we're in his house now." But Cole knew Marcus was wrong. The sound wasn't a threat. It was a warning. It wasn't meant to scare them away. It was a lament for what was about to happen to them. The second night in the woods was colder than the first. A damp chill had settled into the valley, and the fire, which they had built larger than usual, seemed to offer little comfort against the profound, listening silence of the forest. The mournful howl from the previous night had not returned, but its absence was a source of tension, not relief. The four men sat in a tight, uneasy circle, their earlier bravado having been completely extinguished. Marcus was staring at the old trapper's map, his brow furrowed in concentration, but the narrator could see he wasn't really reading it. He was replaying the how in his mind, trying to fit it into his scientific framework, and failing. Ben nervously checked his camera's battery for the 10th time. His dreams of a glorious documentary now tainted with a primal fear. Davis sat with his rifle across his lap, his knuckles white, his gaze darting into the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight. Only Cole seemed calm, but his calmness was that of a soldier in a trench, a grim acceptance of the inevitable. He was cleaning his knife, his movements slow and methodical, his senses on high alert. The first attack came without warning. It was not a roar or a charge from the darkness. It was a sound, a sharp whizzing noise, followed by a loud percussive thud as something heavy slammed into the thick trunk of a pine tree just a few feet from their fire. Splinters of bark exploded into the air. What the hell was that? Davis yelled, jumping to his feet and raising his rifle. Before anyone could answer, another projectile came hurtling out of the darkness from a different direction. This one crashing into the metal cooler with a deafening clang that sent it spinning across the clearing. And then another, and another. They were being bombarded. It was chaos. The four men scrambled for cover, diving behind the largest trees they could find as a hailstorm of rocks, some as large as a man's head, rained down upon their campsite with a terrifying, calculated precision. The narrator could see the dawning horror on their faces as they realized the impossible truth. This wasn't a rock slide. This wasn't a random event. This was a coordinated, intelligent assault. Something, or some things, were out there in the dark, surrounding them, and using the very landscape as a weapon. The barrage lasted for nearly a minute of pure, helpless terror. The men could only huddle behind the trees, listening to the sickening thuds of the rocks as they smashed their gear, dented their cooking pots, and shattered the illusion that they were the ones in control. Then, as suddenly as it began, the attack stopped. A profound, ringing silence fell over the campsite, broken only by the frantic, ragged breaths of the four men. This was the midpoint, the moment the world turned upside down. The hunt was over. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The profound, ringing silence that followed the rock assault was somehow more terrifying than the attack itself. The four men remained frozen behind their respective trees, their ears straining for any sound, any indication that the unseen assailants were still there. But there was nothing. The forest was once again unnervingly, unnaturally quiet. After several long, tense minutes, Cole was the first to move. He peeked out from behind his tree, his movements slow and cautious. The campsite was a wreck. The cooler was dented almost in half. Their supplies were scattered across the clearing, and several large dark stones lay where they had fallen, like strange, malevolent meteorites. It was Ben who let out a strangled cry of despair. He stumbled out from his cover, his eyes fixed on the corner of the camp where he had set up his precious equipment. Marcus and Davis followed his gaze, and a cold, shared understanding fell over them. His main camera, the one he had been using to film their journey, was smashed, its lens a spiderweb of cracked glass. The sensitive audio recorder was a mangled wreck of plastic and wires, as if it had been deliberately stomped on. And the laptop, which held all their footage, had been hit by a large rock with such force that the screen had been driven through the keyboard. This was the final, terrible confirmation. This was the moment their perception of the situation completely and irrevocably shifted. The narrator could see the gears turning in each of their minds. An animal, even an angry one, would have attacked them. It would have gone for the food. It would not have systematically and with surgical precision destroyed only their recording equipment. It knew, Ben whispered, his voice trembling as he knelt beside the wreckage of his dreams. It knew we were filming. It doesn't want to be seen. This was the true midpoint twist. The attack wasn't just a random act of aggression. It was a calculated, intelligent act designed to do one thing: to blind them, to deafen them, to erase any proof of its existence. Their hunt was a mockery. They hadn't been hunting a creature. They had been observed, assessed, and neutralized by an intelligence that was far superior to their own. The roles had been reversed. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey, isolated, terrified, and completely cut off from the world they knew. Dawn broke, but it brought no comfort. The four men emerged from their makeshift shelters behind the trees, not as a confident team of hunters, but as a scattered, terrified group of survivors. The beautiful, pristine forest they had entered now felt like a hostile, alien planet. Their campsite was a ruin, a testament to the violent, intelligent force that had assaulted them in the night. The narrator, watching them, could see that the true horror was not just the attack itself, but the psychological aftermath that was now beginning to set in. After the initial shock subsided, a grim, desperate need for answers took hold. Marcus, his face pale and drawn, was the first to speak. "We have to track it," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to see where it came from." It was a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, to force the nightmare back into the familiar framework of a hunt. But as they began their investigation, a new and more subtle terror began to dawn on them. They started at the edge of the clearing, where the massive, deep footprints from the initial attack were clearly visible in the soft earth. The tracks led away from the camp back into the dense, dark woods. For the first 50 yards, the trail was clear, a series of huge, deep impressions that were easy to follow. And then, they simply stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was an abrupt, impossible end. The tracks led to a large patch of hard, rocky ground, and on the other side, where the soft, muddy earth resumed, there was nothing. No prints, no scuff marks, no sign that the massive creature had ever continued on its path. That's not possible," Ben stammered, his useless camera hanging limp at his side. "Something that heavy. It would have left some kind of mark, even on the rocks." Cole knelt, his experienced eyes scanning the ground. He saw it then. A single long pine branch had been carefully, deliberately laid across the spot where the next footprint should have been. A few feet further, a cluster of ferns had been arranged to cover another patch of earth. He looked up, his gaze following the path. The creature hadn't vanished. It had been covering its tracks. The realization was a cold, sickening blow. They were not dealing with a simple beast, an animal acting on instinct. They were dealing with an intelligence that was actively, consciously, and methodically erasing its own presence from the landscape. It was a hunter that knew it was being hunted, and it was taking deliberate steps to ensure its pursuers would find nothing. They were no longer just prey. They were being outsmarted by a ghost. The discovery that the creature was actively hiding its tracks sent a new wave of terror through the group, a terror that was colder and more intimate than the brute force of the rock assault. They were being outsmarted. The narrator, watching their morale crumble, could see the distinct flavors of fear that took root in each man. Ben was consumed by a quiet, technical dread, his mind replaying the image of his smashed equipment, a symbol of technology's utter failure in the face of this primal intelligence. Marcus was battling a rising tide of humiliation. His grand expedition had devolved into a desperate scramble for survival, and his leadership was proving useless. Davis's fear was the loudest, manifesting as a simmering, explosive rage. He saw the creature's intelligence not as a puzzle, but as a personal insult, an act of mockery that demanded a violent response. But it was Cole who understood the true nature of the horror. He knew this wasn't just about intelligence, it was about psychological warfare. The creature wasn't just hiding, it was playing with them. That night, it proved him right. They didn't build a large, welcoming fire. They huddled around a small, low flame, their backs pressed together, a tight, paranoid knot of humanity in the vast, listening darkness. The creature did not attack them with rocks this time. Its assault was far more subtle and far more terrifying. It began with a single, loud snap of a thick branch from the deep woods to the north of their camp. Instantly, all 4 men spun in that direction. Davis raising his rifle, their hearts pounding. They stared into the impenetrable blackness for a full minute, every sense on high alert. Nothing. Then, from the complete opposite side of the camp, to the south, came another identical sound. A heavy branch deliberately snapped. It was a classic hunting tactic, used to disorient prey, to create a phantom threat from one direction while the real danger approaches from another. And it was working. The men were on a swivel, their heads whipping back and forth, their sense of direction and safety completely eroded. The fears were now becoming real, a direct and personal assault. Then came the sounds, a low, guttural cough from the west, a heavy thud, as if something massive had dropped from a tree from the east. It never attacked them directly, it just circled them. A ghost in the darkness, announcing its presence from all sides at once, an omnipresent and inescapable threat. It was a psychological siege, designed to wear them down, to exhaust their adrenaline, to shatter their nerves until they were nothing but a quivering mass of fear. The narrator could see the toll it was taking. The 4 men, once a team, were now just 4 isolated points of terror, each one trapped in his own private nightmare, all of them surrounded by a single, patient, and impossibly intelligent predator. The third night was a descent into a new circle of hell. The psychological siege was relentless. The unseen creature, or creatures, continued their campaign of terror, never showing themselves, but always present. They would throw small pebbles against the trees just outside the firelight, creating a constant, unnerving rain of sound. They would let out low, guttural coughs that sounded chillingly human, always from a new direction. The men did not sleep. They huddled together, their backs to the fire, a small, terrified island of humanity in a vast, predatory darkness. By morning, they were hollowed-out shells, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes wide with the paranoia that had now taken root in their souls. The narrator, watching their descent, could see that the forest itself had become a weapon against them. Their sense of direction was gone. Marcus maps were now just useless pieces of paper. Every tree looked the same, every ridge was identical to the last. They were lost hopelessly and completely. Their supplies were dwindling, but their sanity was dwindling faster. It was in this state of desperate, aimless wandering that they finally stumbled into it. They had been following a dry creek bed, hoping it might lead them to a larger river, when the terrain opened up into a wide, shallow valley they didn't recognize from any map. And the moment they stepped into it, a new and terrible silence fell. A silence that was different from the watchful quiet of the forest. This was the silence of a graveyard. This was the Valley of Bones. The ground was a carpet of white and gray. Bones. Thousands of them. They were everywhere, covering the valley floor in a macabre, shattered landscape. The men stopped, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a profound and horrified awe. These were the bones of every creature that had ever walked these woods. The narrator could see the massive rib cages of elk, the delicate skulls of deer, the heavy, powerful femurs of black bears. But it was not just the sheer quantity of the remains that was so terrifying. It was the arrangement. They were not scattered randomly, as they would be in a natural boneyard. They had been deliberately, meticulously arranged. Skulls were piled together in neat, conical mounds. Rib cages were laid out in long, curving lines that snaked through the valley like the fossilized remains of some great serpent. And in the very center of the valley stood the most horrifying structure of all, a throne, built entirely from the skulls of predators, cougars, wolves, and bears, all facing outwards, their empty eye sockets a silent, eternal warning. The men stood at the edge of the valley, their bravado, their ambition, their very sense of themselves as the dominant species, completely shattered. This was not a lair. This was not a den. This was a temple. It was a monument to the death of countless creatures, built by something that was not just a hunter, but a king, and they had just trespassed in his court. They stood at the edge of the macabre valley, the four of them frozen in a state of horrified reverence. The sheer scale of the boneyard, the deliberate and ritualistic arrangement of the remains, was a testament to an intelligence that was far beyond that of a simple, solitary beast. The narrator, watching them, could see the final, terrible truth dawn on each of them. A truth that shattered their expedition and their understanding of the world. It was Ben, the documentarian, who gave voice to the thought that was taking shape in all their mind. He lowered his useless camera, his face as white as the bone fragments at his feet. This isn't the work of one creature, he whispered, his voice trembling. This is a culture, a society. He was right. The truth revealed itself, a final, horrifying twist about the nature of the entity they had been hunting. This wasn't the lair of a single, monstrous ape. The sheer number of bones, the complexity of the structures, it spoke of years, perhaps centuries, of collective effort. They were not in the territory of a Sasquatch. They were in the territory of a clan. The realization recontextualized every event that had led them to this point. The single footprint hadn't been a lucky find. It had been a deliberate signpost left by a scout. The psychological games in the night hadn't been the work of one creature circling them. It had been multiple individuals coordinating, testing their defenses. The mournful howl they had heard hadn't been a lone cry. It had been a communication, a signal passed between members of a tribe, perhaps a lament for one of their own that had been caught in the trapper's steel jaws long ago. The creature wasn't an animal, it was a people, a primitive, intelligent, and territorial people who had lived in these woods for uncounted generations, a people who did not appreciate trespassers. The men had come here with rifles and cameras, filled with the arrogant belief that they were the superior species, hunting a dumb beast. And now, standing in the heart of their enemy's sacred temple, they understood their mistake. They were not hunters, they were invaders, and they had just committed a blasphemy in a very, very old church. The four men backed slowly away from the bone throne, a unified, retreating wall of terror. The Valley of Bones was not just a graveyard, it was a sanctuary, a holy place, and their presence was a desecration. The narrator, watching from an omniscient perch, could feel the very air in the valley begin to shift, the dead silence replaced by a low, almost subsonic hum. The clan was aware of them. They turned and fled, stumbling over the carpets of bone, their only thought to escape the terrible valley. As they crashed back into the relative darkness of the forest, a new sound began. A sound that was far more terrifying than the mournful howl from the night before. It was the sharp, panicked cry of a blue jay, a common sound in these woods. But it was wrong. It was too loud, too close, and it came from a patch of dense undergrowth where no bird would perch. Davis, his nerves frayed to the breaking point, spun and aimed his rifle at the sound. "Don't!" Cole hissed, grabbing the barrel of the gun and forcing it down. "It's a trick." As if to confirm his words, the blue jay's cry was cut short and replaced by another sound, the low, guttural grunt of a wild boar. The sound came from a different direction, from high up in the canopy of a massive fir tree. It was another impossible sound, another violation of the natural order. This was the entity's manifestation, not as a single creature, but as a disembodied, omnipresent voice. The clan of creatures, hidden in the woods that surrounded them, had begun their final hunt. They were using their voices, their ability to mimic the sounds of the forest, to herd and disorient their prey. The panicked cry of a rabbit would sound from their left, drawing their attention, only to be followed by the aggressive snarl of a cougar from their right. It was a symphony of phantom animals, a chaotic and terrifying orchestra designed to shatter their senses and drive them into a panic. Ben was weeping openly now, his mind, once so analytical, completely broken by the impossible acoustics. Marcus was shouting, a man trying to impose order on a world that had descended into chaos. Davis spun in a circle, his rifle a useless piece of steel against an enemy he could not see. Only Cole seemed to understand. He knew this was not a random series of sounds. This was a hunt, and they were being driven in a specific direction. The cacophony of mimicked animal calls was a disorienting psychological assault, a storm of sound designed to break their minds. The four men were huddled together now, their backs to a large rock formation, a single, terrified unit in a forest that had become their enemy. The narrator, watching them, could see the moment their hope finally died, replaced by a grim, animalistic terror. They were being herded, driven into a kill zone, and then, as if a conductor had lowered his baton, the chaos of sound stopped. A profound, ringing silence fell over the Valley of Bones, and in that silence, they began to emerge. The clan began to manifest clearly. From the deep shadows between the ancient trees, dark shapes began to detach themselves from the darkness. They were not fast, they were slow, deliberate, and utterly confident. One appeared to the left, a massive, hulking form that seemed to block out the very starlight. Another materialized to the right, its long arms hanging nearly to the ground. A third, and then the fourth, appeared directly in front of them, blocking their only escape route. They were surrounded. The creatures stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the men's feeble headlamps. They were silent giants, their massive, powerful forms exuding an aura of ancient and absolute authority. The men could see the glint of their eyes in the darkness, not the red, demonic glow of a simple monster, but the dark, intelligent, and unnervingly calm eyes of sentient beings. In that terrible, silent standoff, the clan's demand was made perfectly clear, though not a single word was spoken. It was not a demand for justice or a negotiation. It was a demand for consumption. This was their territory, their sacred ground. The men were intruders, invaders, a contamination that needed to be erased. The creatures stood there, a silent jury, and their verdict was death. The only question left was how the sentence would be carried out. The silence in the Valley of Bones was a living thing, a weapon of psychological warfare. The four men were trapped, pinned down by the weight of a dozen pairs of intelligent, unblinking eyes that watched them from the impenetrable darkness. The narrator, observing the scene, could see the final threads of their sanity beginning to unravel. Ben was muttering to himself, a litany of prayers and apologies. Marcus was staring at the bone throne, his face a mask of horrified awe, his ambition having finally collapsed into sheer existential dread. Cole was the only one who remained focused, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, his mind racing, trying to find an escape route that he knew did not exist. But it was Davis who broke first. His fear, unlike the others, had no outlet in prayer or quiet contemplation. It had been building inside him, a toxic, high-pressure mixture of terror and humiliation. He was a hunter. He was the one with the gun, and he was being toyed with, surrounded, and judged by a silent council of monsters. His rage, a desperate and violent reaction to his own powerlessness, finally boiled over. To hell with this, he snarled, the words a ragged tear in the perfect silence. I'm not gonna die cowering in the boneyard. Before anyone could stop him, he scrambled to his feet, shouldered his high-power rifle, and opened fire. The roar of the rifle was a deafening, obscene violation of the valley's sacred quiet. Muzzle flashes lit up the clearing in a series of frantic, strobing bursts, momentarily illuminating the towering, monstrous shapes that stood watching in the trees. Davis wasn't aiming at anything specific. He was just shooting at the darkness, at the silence, at his own all-consuming fear. "Davis, no, stop!" Cole screamed, but his voice was lost in the thunderous reports of the rifle. Davis emptied his entire magazine in a blind, furious panic, the hot shell casings ejecting and clattering onto the bone-strewn ground. For a moment, the only sounds were the deafening gunshots and Davis's own ragged, angry shouts. It was a final, desperate, and utterly foolish act of defiance against a power he could not comprehend, and it would cost him everything. The deafening roar of Davis's rifle finally died, leaving a ringing, profane silence in its wake. For a single, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The dark, towering shapes in the trees remained perfectly still. The narrator, watching the scene unfold, could feel the entire valley holding its breath. Davis stood panting, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the cold air, a look of wild, triumphant terror on his face. He had acted, he had fought back, and then, from the deep shadows to the north, came a sound that was not a howl, not a grunt, but a high-pitched, almost childlike cry of pain. One of Davis's blind, panicked shots had found its mark. The consequence was immediate and absolute. The mournful howl they had heard the night before, the one that had sounded like a lament, was nothing compared to the sound that erupted from the forest now. It was a chorus of pure, unified rage. A dozen voices, a dozen of the massive creatures, roared as one. It was not the sound of an animal, it was the sound of a family, a clan, reacting to the wounding of one of their own. It was a declaration of war. The silent, watching siege was over. The hunt had begun in earnest. The payoff for Davis's foolish act of defiance was a swift and brutal escalation. The first of the creatures to move was a blur of motion. A massive, dark shape launched itself from the tree line with a speed that defied its size. Not at Davis, but at Ben. Ben, who was still fumbling with his broken camera, looked up just in time to see a rock the size of a bowling ball hurtling through the air towards him. He had no time to scream. The rock hit him squarely in the chest with a sickening, wet crunch, sending him flying backwards into the bone throne, his body limp before it even hit the ground. "Ben!" Marcus screamed, his voice a raw, broken sound. Before they could react to the loss of one of their own, another creature charged from the opposite side. This one was lower to the ground, moving on all fours with a terrifying, ape-like speed. It ignored the others and went straight for Davis. Davis tried to raise his rifle to fire another shot, but he was too slow. The creature slammed into him, its immense weight and momentum carrying him to the ground. The narrator could hear the snap of bone. And then Davis's screams, high and terrible, were abruptly cut off as the creature dragged his struggling form back into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. It had all happened in less than 10 seconds. Their group of 4 had been reduced to 2. Marcus and Cole were alone, back to back in the center of the boneyard, surrounded by the roars and the heavy, crashing sounds of the enraged clan moving through the trees around them. The battle was no longer a hunt. It was a slaughter. The slaughter was swift and brutal. The narrator, a silent witness to the carnage, could see the final, terrible moments of the hunt play out with a horrifying clarity. Ben was already gone, a still, broken shape, slumped against the bone throne, his dream of a groundbreaking documentary ending in a single, crushing blow. Davis's screams had been swallowed by the darkness, his body dragged into the woods, leaving only his discarded rifle in the dirt as a testament to his futile rage. Now, only Marcus and Cole were left, 2 terrified men standing back to back in the center of the valley, surrounded by the guttural roars and the heavy, crashing sounds of the enraged clan. The creatures were no longer toying with them. This was not a psychological game anymore. This was a massacre. From the shadows, a massive, hulking figure charged towards Marcus. It was the largest of the clan, its eyes burning with a cold, intelligent fury. Marcus, who had started this journey with such arrogant confidence, was now just a man facing his own extinction. He raised the plaster cast of the footprint he had made, a pathetic, useless shield, as if to remind the creature of the scientific curiosity that had led them here. The creature swatted it aside, the cast shattering into a cloud of white dust. But in that moment, something shifted in Marcus. The obsessive, glory-seeking hunter was gone, replaced by something older, something more noble. He looked at Cole, his friend, the one person he had dragged into this nightmare against his better judgment, and he made a choice. "Run, Cole," Marcus screamed, his voice a raw, desperate command. And then he did something utterly insane. He didn't run away from the creature. He ran towards it, screaming, waving his arms, making himself the bigger, more immediate threat. It was a final, desperate act of sacrifice. A last, tragic attempt to buy his friend a few precious seconds. Cole didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his survival instincts overriding the grief and horror of watching his friend's final noble act. He didn't see what happened to Marcus. He only heard a single, terrible, wet, tearing sound, followed by a sudden, final silence. He didn't look back. He just ran, the sounds of the massacre echoing in his mind, a symphony of his own failure and his friend's terrible end. Cole ran. He ran with the burning fire of a man who had stared into the abyss and had been, for some unknown reason, spared. He ran with the screams of his friends echoing in his mind, a sound far more terrible than the creature's roar. He ran with the weight of his own survival, a guilt so profound it was a physical burden. He didn't know how long he ran. The forest was a black, churning nightmare of whipping branches and grasping roots. He fell. He cut himself. He got back up and kept running. His only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and the valley of bones. He ran until his lungs were on fire and his legs were numb, until he finally collapsed at the edge of a small, gurgling stream, his body and his spirit completely broken. He lay there for hours, drifting in and out of a state of shock, the terrible images of the night replaying in his mind. Ben's broken form against the bone throne, Davis's screams being swallowed by the darkness, and Marcus, his friend, his foolish, brave leader, making his final, hopeless charge. As dawn broke, painting the sky in a soft, indifferent gray, a new sound began to filter through the woods. It was the sound of birds tentatively beginning their morning chorus. The oppressive, deathly silence of the clan's territory was gone. But for Cole, the silence that now filled his soul was far more terrifying than the screams in the woods. He was alone. He was the only one left. He eventually found his way back to the main trail, and 2 days later, a search party found him, wandering aimlessly, dehydrated, and in a state of profound shock. The psychological wounds the narrator knew would never truly heal. He had survived, but he had paid the ultimate price. He had left his friends and his own innocence behind in that terrible, silent forest. Cole was found 3 days later by a pair of hikers on a little-used trail 10 miles from where the group had parked their SUV. He was curled up at the base of a large cedar tree, suffering from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and a profound bone-deep shock. He was a ghost of the man who had walked into the woods a week earlier, his eyes vacant, his body covered in a lattice of cuts and deep bruises. His story, when he was finally able to tell it, was a frantic, fragmented, and ultimately unbelievable tale. He spoke of a silent forest, of impossible stick structures, of a valley of bones, and of a clan of intelligent, monstrous creatures that had hunted his friends. He spoke of a sacrifice, of a desperate, lonely flight through the dark. The official report, of course, did not mention any of this. The narrator, who sees the cold, hard lines of official records, knew how the story would be framed. Cole was a sole, traumatized survivor of a horrific bear attack. The bodies of Marcus and Ben were eventually found in what the report called a boneyard, a natural gathering place for animal remains, and their deaths were attributed to the same bear. Davis was never found, his disappearance chalked up to being dragged off by the animal. Cole's story was dismissed as a classic case of survivor's guilt and trauma-induced delusion, the product of a mind broken by an unimaginable ordeal. He was hailed as a hero, a man who had miraculously survived a mauling. But Cole never felt like a hero. He felt like a coward. He felt like a ghost. The world he returned to was a loud, bright, and alien place. The familiar sounds of the city, the drone of traffic, the chatter of people, it was all a meaningless cacophony to a man whose ears were still ringing with the screams of his friends and the terrible, unified roar of the clan. Cole tried to rebuild his life, He moved away from the mountains, taking a quiet desk job in a city where the tallest structures were made of steel and glass, not ancient trees. But the forest had left its mark on him. The haunting followed him. He became a man who was terrified of silence, who slept with the television on, who flinched at the sound of a branch snapping in the wind outside his window. The vast, open wilderness he had once loved had become his personal hell. Years bled into a decade, then two. Cole became a ghost in his own life, a man haunted by a memory that the world had dismissed as a delusion. He lived in a small, quiet apartment on the edge of the city, a place he had chosen for its proximity to a large, sprawling urban park. It was a foolish choice, he knew, but some part of him, some deep, masochistic instinct, needed to be near the trees, to be near the familiar shadows that had defined his life and his laws. He never remarried. He had few friends. He was a solitary man, his only companions the ghosts of Marcus, Ben, and Davis. He would see their faces in crowds, hear their laughter in the wind. The haunting had followed him, and the narrator, watching his lonely existence, knew that the evil had not been vanquished. It had only retreated, waiting. On most nights, the sounds of the city were a comforting, chaotic lullaby that kept the silence at bay. But some nights, when the wind was just right and the city held its breath, he would hear it. It would start just after midnight, a low, mournful sound drifting through his open window from the direction of the park. At first, he told himself it was a train whistle or the lonely howl of a stray dog. But he knew what it was. It was the same low, pained, and impossibly ancient howl he had heard in the forest all those years ago. It was not a memory. It was real, and it was close. The haunting had not just followed him. It had caught up. The final terrible realization settled into his soul with a cold, leaden weight. They were not just a forgotten legend in a remote, untouched wilderness. They were expanding their territory. They were adapting. And they were here. The narrator could see the final, horrifying truth. The forest Cole had run from was no longer just a place on the map. It was a memory that was now growing, its shadows stretching to encompass the entire world. Cole would spend the rest of his life as a silent watchman, a man who knew the true nature of the howls that the city dwellers dismissed as nothing more than the lonely sounds of the night. And so, the story of Cole, the man who hunted a legend and became haunted by it, does not end in the forest. It ends in a small, quiet apartment, with the sound of a distant, impossible howl drifting through an open window. The narrator, watching this final, quiet chapter of his life, can see the terrible truth. The hunt never ended. The creature, the clan, had not forgotten him. They had simply been patient. The forest he had escaped was not just a place on a map. It was a living, growing territory, and its borders were expanding. Cole would live out the rest of his days as a silent watchman, a man with a terrible secret in a world that refused to believe him. He would see the faces of his friends in every passing crowd, hear their last screams in every sudden noise. He would be a ghost, walking among the living, forever bound to the memory of the Valley of Bones. This story, then, is his final, unspoken warning. It is a testament to the idea that some legends are not stories to be debunked, but warnings to be heeded. Some places are not meant for human feet, and some creatures are not meant to be found. The arrogance of four men led them into the heart of a darkness they could not comprehend, and only one returned, carrying a piece of that darkness with him forever. So, the next time you hear a story of a monster in the woods, the next time you see a grainy photograph of a hulking, shadowy figure, perhaps do not be so quick to laugh. Perhaps, instead, you should listen. Listen for the silence in the forest, for the howl that sounds a little too human, a little too full of pain, and remember the price that was paid by four men who went looking for a legend, only to find that the legend was looking for them too. What do you believe is the most terrifying monster that could be hiding in our world's last wild places? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of a hunt gone wrong left you with a chill, please leave a like to support the channel. It lets the shadows know you were listening. And if you wish to hear more tales from the deep, dark woods, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. You never know what might be waiting for you just off the trail.